The morning began just like any other. The sun peeked through the blinds as Jim pulled on his old flannel jacket. Happy wagged his tail, already at the door, ears perked in anticipation of their daily stroll. Jim chuckled, ruffling the thick fur behind Happy's ears. "You always know when it's time, don't you, boy? But today, you have to stay home, Happy," Jim said. Happy barked once in response, his tail thumping against the floor. The front door creaked as Jim stepped out, his usual cane in hand. He gave one last glance at his house, as if checking to make sure everything was in place, before heading down the quiet street. It was a normal morning, until it wasn't. Hours passed. The sun rose higher in the sky. The small town bustled with life neighbors chatting over picket fences, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, children laughing as they rode their bikes down the sidewalk. But Jim never returned home. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he had stopped by the cafe and lost track of time. Maybe he was reminiscing with an old friend at the barber shop. But then came the first sign that something was wrong. James Jim Callahan, a retired police detective in his late 70s, had a habit of going for walks with his loyal companion, Happy, a retired K9 German Shepherd. Jim had been through the fire chasing down criminals, cracking cases wide open, facing the most dangerous situations in his career. But now, those days were behind him. These days, life is simple, peaceful. Jim and Happy had settled into a quiet life in his cozy little house on Maple Street. Every morning just after sunrise, Jim would lace up his worn-out boots, grab his cane more out of habit than necessity, and step outside with Happy by his side. The two would take their daily walk through town, stopping by the local cafe where Jim would sip his coffee while Happy lounged at his feet, his sharp eyes still watching everything, even the trained protector. For Jim, Happy wasn't just a dog, he was family. Even in retirement, Happy never lost his keen instincts, and Jim still carried himself like a man who had seen things most people wouldn't believe. He had spent decades solving cases, putting criminals behind bars, and unraveling the darkest secrets hidden in the cracks of society. But there was one thing Jim never expected, that he would become a mystery. It was Jim's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who noticed it first. She had just stepped out to water her garden when she glanced over at Jim's house and saw something that made her pause. His front door was slightly ajar. A chill ran down her spine. Jim was many things. A little stubborn, a little old-fashioned, but careless was not one of them. He had spent a lifetime as a detective, always aware of his surroundings, always alert. He would never leave his door open. Curiosity turned to unease as she approached the house. "Jim?" she called, rapping her knuckles against the wooden frame. She hesitated before gently pushing the door open further. The house was just as it always was, nothing out of place, no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no mess. But something about it felt off. That was when she heard it, a low, restless whine from the living room. She turned and saw Happy pacing anxiously near the window, his ears flattened, his body tense. His usual alert stance had shifted into something more frantic. He let out a sharp bark as soon as he saw her, his eyes pleading, his paws moving back and forth as if he was trying to tell her something. Mrs. Henderson's heart sank. She had never seen Happy like this before. Dogs, especially canines, didn't panic over nothing. Happy's eyes darted between her and the open door, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Jim should have been home by now. Word spread fast in Ridgewood. By noon, neighbors had gathered outside Jim's house, murmuring among themselves. Someone called the police, and within an hour, an officer arrived. Happy wouldn't stop barking, his tail stiff, his gaze locked on the road leading out of town. "He's trying to tell us something," one officer muttered, crouching next to the dog. Happy whined, scratched at the door, then bolted toward the street, his nails clicking against the pavement. He ran a few yards before turning back, barking desperately at the humans standing dumbfounded on the porch. He was trying to lead them. He was trying to find Jim. It didn't take long before someone remembered something strange. A black SUV had been seen in the neighborhood that morning, a vehicle no one recognized, and now Jim Callahan was gone. The air grew heavy. The weight of realization hit all at once. This wasn't just a simple case of a man forgetting to come home. Jim had vanished without a trace, and the only one who seemed to understand the urgency of the situation was Happy. The hunt had begun. The sun had barely begun to dip behind the treetops when the search for Jim Callahan officially began. Ridgewood's small police force had mobilized quickly, their flashing blue and red lights cutting through the quiet evening. Neighbors stood on porches, whispering among themselves, concern etched deep into their faces. But there was one searcher who didn't waste time with questions or speculation. This is Happy. While officers spread out, questioning locals and retracing Jim's usual walking route, Happy had only one focus. The retired K-9's sharp eyes darted across the road, his nose twitching, inhaling every scent the wind carried. His body was tense, his tail stiff, his every movement precise. To him, this wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a rescue mission. The unshakable instinct. The moment an officer unhooked Happy's leash, the dog sprang forward, his paws hitting the pavement with purpose. "Whoa, where's he going?" one of the officers muttered as Happy veered away from Jim's usual route. But Happy wasn't second-guessing. He already knew where to go. Ignoring the chatter of the humans behind him, he followed something stronger than logic, stronger than a mere guess ascent. His nose guided him down Maple Street, past the cafe where Jim had his morning coffee, past the town square where he greeted old friends. Then, suddenly, Happy pivoted sharply away from the familiar, away from the predictable. He lunged toward the edge of town, toward the dense, abandoned walking trail that cut through the woods. "Wait a minute," one officer said, frowning as he jogged to catch up. "That's not the way Jim usually goes." But Happy wasn't listening. His ears perked forward, his breath heavy, his paws digging into the soft earth as he pulled harder, faster. Something was out here. The first clue, and then he stopped. For the first time since the search began, Happy froze in place, his head snapping to the left. The officers exchanged glances. "What is it, boy?" one of them asked cautiously. Happy didn't respond with a bark or a growl. Instead, he lowered his nose, sniffing frantically at a patch of dirt near the roadside. Then, with a gentle whimper, he did something that made the officers' hearts skip a beat. He pawed at the ground. One of the officers stepped forward, shining his flashlight on the spot Happy had discovered. The beam of light cut through the evening shadows, revealing a small piece of white fabric tangled in the grass. The officer bent down, carefully plucking it from the dirt. His stomach twisted the moment he saw what it was. A handkerchief. Not just any handkerchief, Jim's. A sudden silence settled over the group. The weight of the discovery pressed down on them all at once. "He was here," one of them murmured. Happy let out a soft but urgent bark, his tail stiff, his gaze flicking between the handkerchief and the road ahead. But then something changed. Happy's body tensed again, but this time his nose twitched wildly, his tail faltering, his paws uncertain. The scent had stopped, just like that, as if Jim Callahan had simply disappeared into thin air. The vanishing trail. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "How does a man just vanish in the middle of the road?" one of them muttered. Happy circled the area, sniffing furiously, trying to catch any lingering trace of Jim, but there was nothing. No more footprints, no tire marks, no struggle, just emptiness. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, the towering trees casting eerie shadows beneath the dimming sky. It was as if Jim had been lifted right off the ground, taken by something or someone who knew exactly how to leave no trace behind. And yet, Happy knew better. He could feel it in his bones, in the rapid beating of his heart. Jim was out there, somewhere, but whoever took him didn't want him to be found. The real hunt had just begun. The town of Ridgewood was bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon sun, its quiet streets carrying the hum of an ordinary day. The sky was clear, a perfect blue stretching endlessly above. Life moved at its usual slow pace. Shopkeepers arranged their storefronts. A few children rode their bikes along the sidewalks, and neighbors exchanged friendly waves from their porches. No one suspected that, in broad daylight, something terrible was about to happen. It was Mr. Dawson, the owner of a small convenience store near the outskirts of town. He had been unloading a delivery truck when he saw something strange, something that didn't sit right with him. "I didn't think much of it at first," Dawson admitted, his voice uneasy as he spoke to the officers. "But now I wish I had." The officers leaned in. "Saw what?" Dawson hesitated before speaking, his fingers tightening around the brim of his cap. A black SUV, parked near the old county road, just sitting there. No movement, no engine running, just waiting. The officer frowned. "You're sure?" Dawson nodded slowly. "I'm sure, and the weirdest part, no license plates." The moment Dawson gave his statement, officers rushed to check any nearby security cameras. And then they found it, a grainy security feed from a gas station across the street. The footage flickered, its timestamp marking just a few hours before Jim was reported missing. The black SUV rolled into frame, moving slowly down the deserted county road, its dark windows concealing whoever was inside. It came to a stop near the curb, idling in the midday heat. The street was eerily empty, no traffic, no pedestrians, just the occasional bird flitting across the screen. Then the image blurred. A figure appeared from the sidewalk, a familiar figure. Jim Callahan. The elderly detective moved at his usual steady pace, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. He seemed unaware of the SUV at first, merely walking his usual route. Then he slowed. Something had caught his attention. The officers watched as Jim turned his head, looking toward the vehicle. For a moment he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty in his movements. And then the SUV door swung open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with precision. Jim barely had time to react before the figure lunged. The next few seconds sent a chill down the officers' spines. Jim struggled, his cane clattering to the pavement as the man grabbed him, his arms flailing in an attempt to push back. But he was outmatched. The figure shoved him toward the open SUV, forcing him inside with brutal efficiency. Jim vanished into the vehicle. The door slammed shut, and then the SUV sped away, disappearing down the empty road. The footage ended. Silence hung heavy in the air. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their jaws tight. This wasn't a case of an old man wandering off. This wasn't a random disappearance. This was a planned abduction. Someone had taken Jim Callahan in broad daylight, on an empty road where no one was supposed to be watching. And whoever had taken him had no intention of bringing him back. The investigation into Jim Callahan's disappearance had just taken a chilling turn. What had initially seemed like an isolated case was now something much bigger, something far more sinister. As the Ridgewood police combed through missing persons reports, an unsettling discovery surfaced. Jim wasn't the first to vanish under these mysterious circumstances. 2 weeks prior, another elderly man had gone missing, an eerily similar case that had largely gone unnoticed in the quiet town. His name was Frank Holloway, a retired police officer, just like Jim. Frank had been reported missing after failing to show up for a weekly poker game with his old colleagues. His front door had been locked, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no leads. Until now. The officers pieced together the details, their expressions tightening with each new revelation. Both Jim and Frank had worked in the force decades ago. Both had retired after long, respectable careers. And as one officer dug deeper into their case histories, a chilling pattern emerged. Jim and Frank had once been partners. More than that. They had worked on the same case. A cold case from 10 years ago, an unsolved murder that had shaken Ridgewood to its core. And now both detectives are gone. The realization sent a ripple of unease through the precinct. This wasn't random. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone was targeting them. But who? And why now? The search for Jim had turned up little evidence so far, but there was one investigator who refused to give up Happy. The retired K9 had been restless ever since Jim vanished, his instincts screaming that his owner was in danger. And that afternoon, as officers expanded their search beyond the town, Happy's sharp nose caught something. It happened when they passed an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Ridgewood, a long-forgotten building that had once been used as a trucking depot. To the officers, it was just another dead end. But to Happy, it was something more. As soon as they approached the building, Happy's body tensed. His ears shot forward. His nose twitched furiously. Then, without warning, he bolted. "Happy, wait!" an officer called, but the German shepherd wasn't listening. He lunged forward, claws scraping against the dirt, his powerful frame moving with urgency. He circled near the side entrance, his nose pressed against the ground, sniffing, searching. Then he barked, a sharp, commanding bark. The officers exchanged wary glances before moving toward the spot Happy had fixated on. They knew better than to ignore a trained K9, especially one as skilled as Happy. Carefully, they examined the ground where he had been sniffing, and that was when they saw it. Tire tracks, fresh ones, the kind that didn't belong near an abandoned warehouse. One officer crouched down, running his fingers along the imprints in the dirt. "These are recent," he muttered. "Someone was here." The tension in the air thickened. If someone had been here after Jim went missing, did that mean this place had something to do with his disappearance? They had no choice. They had to go inside. With their guns drawn, the officers pushed open the rusted warehouse door, its metal hinges groaning under the weight of time. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, the dim light filtering through shattered windows. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, and yet someone had been here. Footprints in the dust, the faint scent of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Something wasn't right. As they swept the area, Happy moved with precision, his nose guiding him deeper into the shadows. Then he stopped. A low growl rumbled in his throat. His eyes locked onto something in the far corner of the room. A table, an old wooden table covered in dust, except for one thing, a single photograph sitting in the center. The officers exchanged cautious looks before one of them stepped forward, picking up the yellowed, brittle paper. As he brushed off the dust, his breath caught. It was a group photo, a police unit, and right there, standing in the middle of the group, Jim Callahan and Frank Holloway. The officer's fingers tightened around the photo. His pulse quickened as he scanned the faces. These were all former officers, and then he saw it. One of the men standing just behind Jim and Frank had been murdered 10 years ago. A cold case, a case Jim and Frank had worked on together. The officer's throat went dry. This can't be a coincidence. Someone had left this on purpose. A warning. A message. Jim hadn't just been kidnapped. He was being silenced. And whoever was behind this wasn't finished yet. The night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the tension hanging over Ridgewood. The usually quiet streets were eerily still, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The search for Jim Callahan had turned into something darker than anyone had anticipated. This wasn't a simple missing person case. It was deliberate, planned, and somewhere out there, someone knew exactly where Jim was. Officer Ethan Carter sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, parked a few houses down from Jim's. He wasn't technically supposed to be here. His shift had ended an hour ago, but something about this case kept gnawing at him. Maybe it was because he'd known Jim for years. Maybe it was because he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Something right in front of them. But it wasn't Ethan's instincts that picked up on it first. It was Happy. The retired K9 had been restless all day, his body tense, his ears constantly flicking at the smallest sound. But now, as they sat in the silence of the dimly lit street, he froze. His muscles coiled tight, his nose flaring as he inhaled a scent carried by the wind. Then a growl, low, deep, dangerous. Ethan tensed immediately, his eyes following Happy's gaze. The German shepherd's entire body was locked in place, every hair along his spine raised in warning. Something was wrong. Ethan followed his partner's line of sight. And then he saw him. A dark figure lingered in the shadows across the street, near the alley that ran alongside Jim's house. The man wasn't moving like a passerby, wasn't looking around like a neighbor out for a late stroll. He was watching, Ethan's hand instinctively went to his holster. He didn't like this. Didn't like it at all. He opened the car door, stepping out cautiously, keeping his voice steady. "Hey, can I help you?" The man stiffened, but he didn't bolt. He turned slowly, as if weighing his options. Then, just as Happy let out another growl, the man did something that set every alarm off in Ethan's mind. He smirked, not nervous, not surprised. Ethan felt his pulse spike. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. The man lifted his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, officer," he said, his voice slick, oozing with false confidence. "Just out for some fresh air." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "Funny place for that. Name?" The man hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and in that second, Happy lunged forward, barking viciously, his powerful body straining against the leash. The man's smirk vanished. That's when Ethan knew. Happy recognized him. Ethan's mind raced, sifting through his memory, piecing together the half-familiar face in front of him. And then it clicked. The cartel case. Years ago, Jim had been part of a task force that took down one of the biggest drug operations on the East Coast. The cartel had been dismantled, but a few key players had slipped through the cracks. And this man? One of them. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message. Jim hadn't just been kidnapped. He had been hunted down. And now the question wasn't why he was taken. It was who was calling the shots. The tension in Ridgewood had thickened like a storm cloud, and Happy wasn't the only one sensing it. Every lead in Jim Callahan's disappearance was pointing toward something bigger, something that had been waiting to resurface for a long time. And then they found the letter. It was Detective Sarah Holt who discovered it. She had been combing through Jim's home, searching for anything at all, that might hint at why someone would take him. The house was exactly as he had left it, everything in order, no signs of forced entry. But then she noticed it, an envelope, half buried beneath a stack of old case files on Jim's desk. Unmarked, slightly yellowed with age, yet untouched by dust, as if it had been placed there recently. With careful fingers, Sarah picked it up, her heart pounding. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable Jim's. Sarah hesitated before opening it. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest. What had Jim known? What had he foreseen? She unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the inked words, and as she read, the air seemed to thicken. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it in time. It means they found me." Sarah's breath caught. Found him? Who was they? 10 years ago, I made the biggest arrest of my career. The name Ricardo Alvarez still haunts this town, the cartel boss we locked away after years of chasing ghosts. We thought we had won, but we didn't, because Alvarez wasn't the real mastermind. He was just the face they let us see, the man calling the shots, the one pulling the strings. We never caught him. He disappeared before we could put the puzzle together. Sarah's hands tightened around the paper. A cartel leader they never caught? A ghost in the system? Frank and I always knew we'd missed something. We dug deeper even after the case was closed. And then one day Frank stopped. Said we needed to leave it alone. Said we were getting too close to something we weren't supposed to see. I didn't listen. Now he's gone. And I know I'm next. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. This isn't about revenge. This is about tying up loose ends. Someone out there doesn't want the past uncovered. They don't want the real story coming to light. And if they've come for me, they won't stop. Not until every last piece of this case is buried with me. The final line sent ice through her veins. Find the truth before they find you. Sarah let out a slow breath, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Jim. It was bigger, older, deadlier. Someone from 10 years ago had finally emerged from the shadows, and Jim Callahan was their last unfinished piece. The cartel wasn't just back. They had never left. The air was thick with tension as the convoy of police vehicles sped toward the abandoned factory on the outskirts of Ridgewood. The address had been uncovered just hours ago, a location that had appeared in old case files from Jim's last big arrest. It had once been a smuggling hub for the cartel, long since abandoned, or so they had thought. But they weren't going in blind. They had Happy. The retired K-9 was in the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, his eyes sharp, his body tense with a singular purpose-finding Jim. The moment they had pulled up the satellite image of the factory, Happy had reacted immediately, whining, pacing, his instincts screaming that this was it. Jim was here, and time was running out. The factory loomed in the distance, its skeletal remains swallowed by the encroaching woods. The building was dark, its towering smokestacks reaching into the starless sky like jagged fingers. No lights, no movement. But that didn't fool anyone. The police moved quickly, assembling into formation, weapons drawn. This wasn't just a routine operation. This was a rescue mission. "Move in on my mark," Detective Sarah Holt whispered into her radio, her pulse hammering. Then she gave the signal. The officers advanced in silence, their boots crunching softly against the gravel. Happy was leading the way, his nose working furiously, sniffing through the layers of dust, rust, and decay. He darted toward a side entrance, pausing just long enough for the officers to force it open. The door groaned as it gave way, revealing a vast, dimly lit interior. Then Happy froze. His ears shot forward, his nose flared. He had found something. Without hesitation, Happy sprinted deeper into the factory, weaving through rusted machinery and forgotten crates. The officers followed closely, their weapons raised, their eyes scanning every shadow. Then Happy stopped abruptly in front of a thick metal door. He barked, once, twice. Then he lunged, pawing at the door frantically. "He's here," Sarah whispered. "Jim's behind this door." One of the officers rushed forward, testing the handle locked. "Breach it," Sarah ordered. A heavy boot slammed against the door, once, twice, crack. The door burst open, and there he was, Jim Callahan. Jim was slumped against the wall, his hands bound, his face bruised but alive. His weary eyes lifted as the officers flooded in. They had found him. But before relief could settle, gunfire erupted. The kidnappers were still here. Shots rang out from the catwalks above. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as bullets ricochet off steel beams. "Take cover!" someone shouted as the team scrambled behind whatever they could find. Happy snarled, his body low, his gaze locked onto the shadows moving above. His ears twitched, pinpointing a figure reloading, and then he moved. In one swift motion, Happy lunged forward. A snarl ripped through the air as he sank his teeth into the leg of a gunman who had just aimed at Sarah. The man screamed, his weapon firing wildly as he collapsed, his gun skidding across the floor. The distraction was enough. The officers took their shot 2 kidnappers down, another tackled to the ground. The last one hesitated, realizing he was outnumbered. He dropped his weapon, raising his hands in surrender. The fight was over. Sarah rushed to Jim, cutting his restraints, her voice barely steady. "We got you," she said. "You're safe now." Jim let out a weak chuckle. "Took you long enough." But as he looked around at the unconscious kidnappers, at the cartel's old factory repurposed for something sinister, his expression darkened. "This wasn't just about me," he murmured. "They were never going to stop." Sarah met his gaze, understanding settling in. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the abandoned factory in an eerie glow as sirens pierced the night air. The once hidden shadows of corruption were finally being dragged into the open. Jim Callahan had been found, but the real fight was just beginning. As the officers secured the last of the kidnappers, Detective Sarah Holt stood over their ringleader, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, his face twisted in defiance, even as he knelt on the cold concrete. "You're done," Sarah said, her voice hard. "Whatever you were planning, it's over." But the man laughed. Low, quiet at first, then louder. Sarah's grip on her weapon tightened. "What's so funny?" The man lifted his chin, his smirk unfazed despite the blood on his lip. "You really think this ends with me?" he said, voice dripping with arrogance. "I was just the middleman. The real power? He's been calling the shots long before you even knew what was happening." Sarah felt her stomach knot. The mastermind was still out there. And then Jim, weak but steady, spoke from behind her. "I already know who it is," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "Captain Mason." A heavy silence settled over the room. Sarah's breath hitched. Captain Mason, a man who had once been one of their own, a high-ranking officer, a legend in the force until he had resigned quietly a decade ago, right after the cartel case Jim had helped close. The pieces snapped together. Mason hadn't retired, he had switched sides. Sarah turned back to the kidnapper, who simply smirked. They had been chasing ghosts while the real puppet master was pulling the strings. The paramedics arrived, surrounding Jim, checking his vitals, but he waved them off with a weak chuckle. "I'll live," he muttered, rubbing his wrists where the restraints had cut into his skin. His eyes, sharp despite his ordeal, locked onto Sarah's. "We have work to do." Sarah nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The kidnappers were arrested, their operation dismantled. But the man who had orchestrated it all, the one who had been cleaning up loose ends for years, was still out there. Jim exhaled, looking at Happy, who sat loyally by his side, eyes alert. He reached down, running his fingers through the fur of the dog who had saved him. "You knew all along, didn't you, boy?" Happy let out a small bark, his tail flicking once. Jim turned back to Sarah. "We're not finished yet." Sarah holstered her weapon, her jaw tight. No, they weren't. This was just the beginning. The morning sun had barely begun to rise over Ridgewood when news of Jim Callahan's rescue spread through town like wildfire. The once quiet streets buzzed with talk of the retired K-9 who had done what no one else could, found his missing partner, uncovered a criminal conspiracy, and led the police straight to the truth. At the heart of it all was Happy. The German Shepherd had never given up, never hesitated, never lost focus. Not when Jim vanished, not when the trail ran cold, and not when danger loomed in the darkness of that abandoned factory. He had trusted his instincts, trusted his training, and most of all, trusted the unbreakable bond he shared with Jim. And because of that, Jim was alive. As Jim was checked by the medics and the last of the criminals were loaded into patrol cars, something unusual happened. A crowd had gathered. Neighbors, shop owners, old colleagues, people who had known Jim for years, people who had followed the story, people who had prayed for his safe return. And all of them had one thing to say: "That dog is a hero." The Ridgewood police chief stood in front of the crowd, clearing his throat as he looked down at Happy, who sat proudly beside Jim, ears perked, eyes scanning everything as if still on duty. "In all my years," the chief said, shaking his head, "I've seen officers do some incredible things, but this, a retired K-9 refusing to quit until his partner was found, I don't think I've ever seen anything like it." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Then the applause began. It started with a single clap, then another, and another, until the whole street erupted in cheers. Happy tilted his head at the noise, his tail giving a slow, uncertain wag. Then, as if realizing the celebration was for him, he let out a single, sharp bark. The crowd laughed, cheered louder. The news spread beyond Ridgewood. A retired K-9 saving his missing partner, taking down a criminal network in the process. The story was on every local station, every newspaper headline, every social media feed. Happy, the dog who never gave up, had become a legend. When Jim finally stepped back into his house, Happy at his side, everything felt different. The door creaked the same way it always did. The living room smelled of old books and fresh coffee, just as he had left it. His favorite chair still had Happy's fur all over it. But Jim was not the same man who had walked out that door days ago. He had spent his whole life believing in justice, believing that the good guys always won. But this case, this one had almost broken him. If not for Happy, if not for his relentless loyalty, his unwavering determination, Jim would have been just another loose end, Jim knelt beside the dog, his fingers scratching behind his ears. "You saved me, boy," he murmured. "In more ways than one." Happy let out a content sigh, leaning into his touch. For the first time in weeks, Jim felt safe. He looked around the quiet house, at the life he had nearly lost, at the dog who had brought him home. The battle wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, still enemies lurking in the shadows. But tonight they had won. And Jim wouldn't trade this moment for anything.